Hi, it's Amy from GoWithLess. I'm so glad you're here. You may notice a certain somebody is missing. Tim is behind the camera today, and it is because I am doing something very, very special on our channel today, and that is interviewing my parents. My parents are what we call the OGs of fire. They fired back in the early 90s. They didn't have any peers, no internet, no blogs, no cell phones even, to do the life that you're gonna hear that they have led, and it's unbelievable that they've done it without those resources. Now, just a little bit about me and my husband, Tim. We retired in 2015 in our mid to late 40s. In January of 2020, we sold our home to travel the world full-time as nomads. Every Wednesday, we share our early retired nomadic life story on our channel, so we hope you'll give it a thumbs up. Subscribe over here for those Wednesday videos. Now, just a little, and just like housekeeping, I have two sets of parents. I'm close with all four of them, but this is my dad and stepmom. So it might make things a little bit more sensible as my dad tells their story. Stay tuned, and I'm going to see you on the other side of this for some lessons that I've learned from them.
Hi, I'm Jim. I'm here in Washington, D.C. with my wife Marlene, and I am glad to have an opportunity to finally say howdy to Tim and Amy's GoWithLess community. A little bit about my background. I grew up in Pennsylvania and ended up with my young family going to work in Manhattan. I realized I would probably have a number of jobs, so I could have a number of jobs within Manhattan where there's plenty of work all the time, and keep my family in one place in suburbia, and my kids could graduate from school and not be bothered much with their dad's work. My career in New York consisted of financial institutions, working for city government itself, the Transportation Administration, and in management consulting. In those jobs, I just saw a lot of what the world became from the time I was just a youngster to the time I fired in 1992. During that time, I met Marlene, and let's hear what her background is.
Hi, I'm Marlene, and I am a city slicker. Growing up in Denver, I knew that I wanted to go somewhere terrific for college, and decided to go to college in Washington, D.C. So at the age of 17, I moved to Washington to start my college career and what turned out to be my career on the East Coast of America. My parents did not have the money to send me to college, so I had to put myself through, and I did that by becoming a nanny to a Lyndon Johnson administration family. I had a job at the Housing and Urban Development, and I had other part-time jobs as well. At the end of my college years, I married my high school sweetheart, and we traveled for 6 months. He was given a fellowship, and we actually hitchhiked through East Africa, and we traveled through many countries in Europe as well. I decided after he graduated from law school that I wanted to move back to a big city. So we moved to the Big Apple, also known as New York City, and I had several careers there, in different positions in financial institution. And I'm very proud of the fact that I was a glass ceiling breaker at my last position. I was the only woman on the board of directors. I was senior vice president, head of human resources.
When I first moved to Manhattan, it was with the understanding of seeking my fortune and raising my family. Having accomplished both in January of 1991, I convinced Marlene that it was best for us to get off the fat cat train in New York and go and see the world. I'm a very goal-focused person, and our vision was to explore the capitals of Western civilization, starting in Egypt and ending in London from about 4000 BC to 1900 AD. And if you look at Europe and parts of the Middle East and block it out from Egypt and Israel up to St. Petersburg, over to Ireland and down to Morocco, and cross out that rectangle, everything in there and every interesting thing we spent in it, just all of our time exploring. Our longest exploration was 182 consecutive days spent out of London and taking assorted trips throughout Northern Europe. in which no one looked at our mail back in the United States. No one looked to see whether we were called for jury duty or whether our income taxes had been rejected or whether anything else happened. Whenever we got back after 6 months, we had 6 duffel bags of mail that we had to process. We had set up a condominium home for us back in Denver that we returned to. We were allowed to live there. It was a senior place. We weren't senior at the time, but we weren't there much of the time, so they let us stay. At the time I fired, I was 47 years old. Marlene was 44 years old, and
what year was it?
We left New York in the spring of 1992.
Every day I lived in New York City, I absolutely loved it, and I never thought that I would leave New York. However, when Jim proposed the idea of walking away from our careers, I felt a tremendous ambivalence about it because I had tremendous pressure at my job and worked probably about 12 hours a day for almost 20 years. So I was totally burned out. So the idea of leaving New York City and leaving my job to travel was very enticing to me. As Jim mentioned, we left when I was 44 and Jim was 47, and it was a total new world for us. It was at a time when there were very little cell phones. We didn't have a cell phone. We didn't have a computer. We didn't have the internet. So the way that we traveled was we would go to a city and go to their information desk and get a hotel. So that was our travels. We were kind of used to that. I lived, even though it was the fat cat 80s, particularly Wall Street in New York City, I lived a pretty frugal life, and I lived that way my entire life. I think it started when my mom gave me my first savings account, and I must have been about 5 or 6 years old, and I loved to put my allowance or to put presents into my savings account and watch the interest grow. I know interest is kind of a bizarre thing to talk about since we haven't had interest in about 12 years in America, but I loved it. And it stayed with me my entire life. I loved to save money. When I worked, I lived on about 30% of my net income. And I didn't live the life that my peers were living. They would say, why aren't you taking a taxi to work? Or why don't you take a taxi home? Or why aren't you going to some of the chic fashion stores to get your clothes? And I didn't do any of that. I figured out by the time we left New York that I had saved $50,000 by taking the subway instead of taxing as many of my peers were doing. I also, when I went to the ballet or when I went to the theater, I always got the least expensive seat. So I'd be sitting in a $10 seat and I'd look at my friends who were way down in the orchestra spending multiples of that amount. So I've been frugal, so I knew that when Jim and I set off on this new adventure that we would make it and that we would continue with the way that we had always lived.
With our original goal of seeing Europe completed, the question became what to do. Marlene had a guilt attack and thought about getting back to work. I made her an offer she couldn't refuse, and that was to take advantage of being resident in North America and doing to North America what we had done to Europe, from Acapulco to northern Canada and Alaska, to see everything on the continent of North America that was worth seeing. That included every state capital, every large city, every national park that you could get to that wasn't in North Alaska, and most of the important state parks and the presidential libraries and all of the museums that are important. So we bought every book in Michelin Guides and Frommer's and Fodor's, and in 1995 we got our first computer, and I was able to put into our computer everything to do in the entire North America continent. And there were things that we had done, things we didn't want to do, and everything left over. Everything left over resulted in 8 years of full-time travel that went drove across the country 3 times, over and back. And if it crossed the Mississippi, we flew and rented a car, and ended up actually doing everything there is to do in North America. When we got done with that, we were then, what are you going to do now? And they made Marlene a third offer, was to do the best we could at the rest of the world that we hadn't already done, which meant that we needed to engage a travel agent. We used a company called Smart Tours that traveled and was frugal the same way we were. And because of the vast distances of going to the South America and India and China and Australia, we needed their support just to handle the logistics. So by the end of another 10 years, we have now completed our world adventures. So we are extraordinarily well-traveled and knowledgeable in pretty much the world and its history. It's been a hoot. Now at the age of 77, I'm pretty much played out, as you might imagine, and I'm now looking for my next adventure, and that's going to take some thinking. Good to meet you.
The reason that I was convinced each time Jim came to me with a new plan was that I was able to spend my time with someone who has a phenomenal sense of humor. So I spent a lot of time miserable because of the travels and the hardships, but also laughing. And what is so great to see on these videos every week is Amy and Tim laughing. And you can see that they really enjoy the adventure that they're in, and they enjoy it every day. And I am so proud of Tim, and I'm so proud of Amy for taking this fire to a whole other level. I wouldn't have been able to be a nomad, to just not have a home somewhere. And I counseled them to not be nomads. But what they've done, and what they've done during COVID, selling their home a month before COVID, and then going off on their adventure with the happiness and the flexibility that they show, is absolutely remarkable.
I am so grateful to my parents for sharing their story, and I'm going to lend a little bit of maybe reassurance to some of the parents out there who are trying to teach their kids fire money lessons and wondering if it is sinking in. If you've been here for a while, you may remember that Tim and I used to spend $115,000 a year. We did think that we were frugal back then, which is kind of crazy, but we saw their life of freedom, of all this great travel, and it was very inspiring. So we didn't talk about the 4% rule or safe withdrawal rates or things like that, but just understanding about spending with your values was always just part of growing up. So we were always big in experiences over stuff for Christmases and birthdays and things like that. So that's just how I was raised. Now, because we spent so much, it didn't look like we would be on a fire path given that trajectory, and we made a major change to be able to leave our jobs and reach fire. So my message for the parents out there is maybe your children are seeing your examples and taking that in, and maybe those seeds will be planted at some point. So we can all hope for that, I guess, right? So it did take a while. I didn't retire until I was 46, but again, I don't know that I would have retired early at all had it not been for their wonderful example. So it's incredible because my parents they've been everywhere, they've done everything, so they're an unbelievable resource, and I'm so grateful that they're in my life. So sending you a giant I love you to them, and I hope that you will share down below. I want to know what your parents brought to the picture. Were they a positive or negative influence in your life as it relates to your fire journey? Please share below. See you next Wednesday.